As I said before, would you listen to somebody who constantly won street races if the reason that they won is that they had some fast and furious booster on their car? What's up, guys? So today I want to get into whether or not natural lifters should be listening to those who use performance-enhancing drugs for lifting and training advice. This video is in part inspired by a post made by Dr. Mike Israetel, and in that he mentions, would you not listen to somebody who races exotic cars if you are a regular driver? Would they not have knowledge to impart as somebody who races exotic cars? And in that, Jared Feather commented down below saying, would a Michelin star chef not have advice for a regular chef or somebody who's just cooking at home? Would a lot of the principles not apply? And obviously they are saying that just because somebody is doing something at a very high level doesn't mean that their advice cannot help other people. Now, the reality is, analogies are analogies. They're always going to have flaws, but I actually do see some major flaws with this kind of rhetoric, especially when in the post itself, Mike says that this is usually a cope by natural lifters for their mediocrity, basically saying that a lot of natural lifters who are not doing much will just say, hey, this person is using steroids, and ignore their advice as if they have nothing to teach. And I really do think there's a problem with saying that that is just a cope. The reality is you can make just about anything sound ridiculous if it's said in a certain way. But the truth is, somebody who is racing exotic cars, there's so much more to dive into to say, is this somebody who I would want to take advice from? First of all, are they actually good at what they do? If you are a steroid user and you have gained a lot of muscle, how do you compare to other steroid users, other people who are enhanced? Just because somebody races exotic cars doesn't mean that they're actually good at it. It just means that their car is going to go faster than yours. I would not take driving advice from somebody who just happens to have a Ferrari that can go 200 miles an hour, and then they put some boosters on it and now it can go 220. That means absolutely nothing in terms of their driving ability. They could just have this enhancement that's making it much better than somebody who has a Toyota Corolla. It doesn't mean that they're actually a better driver. I thought the chef analogy was particularly flawed because that is a skill set. Somebody who has worked their way up to be a Michelin star chef is somebody who has developed great skills along the way. So the equivalent would be a natural pro bodybuilder. And yes, of course, there's a huge genetic component to that, but that would be that they have developed skill and experience over many years. Whereas performance-enhancing drugs is basically a cheat code. So I don't think that analogy works at all. I think, again, the analogy there would be somebody who is a natural pro who has worked their way up over many, many years. Similarly, you could make analogies in the other direction as much as you want. Would you take advice from somebody who is extremely wealthy if you found out that every year they were given a check for $1 million? So after 10 years, they have accumulated a great amount of wealth. Even if they had very poor investment advice and followed very poor investment advice, they could still be far ahead of the average person because they were just given this money every single year. They could be investing in things that are only gaining 5% per year rather than a standard stock market 8 to 10% per year or other investments that might be doing even better than that. But because they are given this advantage, they could be far beyond the average person. And you do see this. You see people who have high incomes who think that they're great at real estate or great at financial advising, and they're actually not. They just have a very high income that makes up for their poor advice and their poor investments. As I said before, would you listen to somebody who constantly won street races if the reason that they won is that they had some fast and furious booster on their car? Would you listen to Kylie Jenner, who was the youngest billionaire or one of the youngest billionaires ever?
Do you know anything about credit?
Not really.
Do you know how to do your own laundry?
No.
Because of her name. Does anybody actually think that the same person of Kylie Jenner who was just born to an unknown family would have become the first and youngest billionaire?
No.
Nobody would actually think that. It's that they had huge, huge advantages. And maybe they did a lot of right things along the way, but that does not mean that that person is qualified to give advice. The reality is there are a lot of very wealthy people who are wealthy in spite of what they are doing, or it just does not apply to you. If you look at the Paul brothers.
Good morning, Jake Paul.
I'm Jake Paul.
No, you're not.
They are extremely successful. But again, they have a lot of money. It does not mean that you would listen to them on financial investing. There are many accountants and financial advisors who actually have very good advice and knowledge. And there are PhDs in finance who teach this, who truly understand micro and macroeconomics, who do not make 1/100th of what some sports star or celebrity makes. You can't just say, well, they have less money and therefore they don't know what they're talking about. Mike Israetel has said on my podcast that genetics are going to be a major factor, right? So that's separate from the performance enhancing side, but genetics are a massive factor. So if you're just looking at somebody who is very jacked, you know almost nothing about their knowledge. And so even more so potentially for performance enhancing drugs, because as I've mentioned before, that is a dial. At least with good genetics, your genetics are basically staying the same throughout. Whereas with drugs, you don't know if that person gained 10 pounds of muscle compared to somebody else who gained 10 pounds of muscle because they're on 500 milligrams of test or a gram of test or a gram of test plus 600 milligrams of DECA. You have no idea how much they're turning that dial to make more and more progress over time. And so it completely muddies the water. And that is why I have an issue with that kind of sentiment to just say it's a cope, because the reality is there's just way too much nuance for a post. Now, of course, the reality is I like Mike. I've obviously talked to Mike. I've met up with Mike. I actually think he is a generally great source of information for a lot of things in the industry. But I wanted to discuss this because this is something that it's always going to be divisive. You're always going to have people, the naturals, who do to some degree cope and say, hey, everybody who's on gear, they know nothing. They're just cheating, even though they're not actually, they might not be competing at anything where it's not allowed. And you're always going to have performance enhancing guys who say, hey, the naturals, natural bodybuilding is not even a thing. They don't know anything. If you're so smart, why are you so skinny? You're always going to have that. And I actually think that Mike is one of the more reasonable people when you talk to him outside of maybe just like a post. If you actually have a real conversation, I think we would probably agree 95% of it. But I do think that nuance is important, because the reality is you have people like a John Meadows who, before he passed, inspired a lot of people and had great knowledge for both naturals and enhanced people. But then you had other people like maybe a Jerry Ward who really was not very knowledgeable and said things after 20, 30 years of lifting, said things that were just completely incorrect, things that were genuinely proven to be incorrect, but he would still talk about them. And he admittedly had used almost everything under the sun. And unfortunately, somebody like Boston Lloyd, kind of a similar thing, where it was all just about chemical warfare. And their training knowledge was really not that great. A lot of what they said would not be good advice for a natural lifter, despite the fact that they were far bigger than almost any natural lifter out there. And as I said, it doesn't mean that they can't be knowledgeable. If you look at somebody who's openly started using performance-enhancing drugs, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, Aaron Straker. Aaron Straker has very solid genetics. He also is now, for the last year or so, he has been using performance-enhancing drugs. That doesn't mean that he lost all that knowledge. He is still just as knowledgeable on natural lifting as he ever was. And so I would never want to take that away from somebody like that. However, the other side to that is he is now 20 pounds or more bigger than he used to be. Does that mean that he has all of this improved knowledge, that somebody would see his current version versus his past version and say, wow, that guy knows a lot more? Of course not. And unfortunately, it is just the reality that steroids, performance-enhancing drugs help tremendously. We have study after study after study showing huge impacts on hypertrophy, muscle growth, when people use steroids, on strength as well, but especially on hypertrophy. And that and genetics, it just masks too much. Again, I think the finance example is a much better analogy than what they brought up, because the reality is, if somebody is poor, yeah, I'm not going to probably take their advice. If somebody is out of shape and fat and just not fit at all, yeah, natural or enhanced, I'm not going to take their advice, because more than likely they have not had any time, quote unquote, in the field to really gain that knowledge through experience as well, even if they had read the textbooks and everything on it. So there is a level where I would say, you know what, you haven't shown that you've walked the walk at all. But beyond a basic level of health and fitness, I mean, we have seen people who are coaches, people who I've named before, who maybe do not have the most impressive physiques, who have coached people to professional bodybuilder status for years they have done this. Dozens and dozens of their clients have gone pro, but they just don't have the genetics and they don't take steroids. So their physiques are fine, but they're not terribly impressive. And you see that all the time. And similarly, I know people who have really great knowledge on, again, economics and finances who they're just not that wealthy. They might be professors, they might just be accountants, they maybe do other things in life. And no, they're not worth $50 million, but I would take their advice over a celebrity who is worth $50 million, who got there by happenstance or just something unrelated to advice on finance. The reality is I don't actually care who uses performance enhancing drugs, and if there weren't side effects, I think it'd be reasonable for far more people to use them. I don't get into the morality of it. As long as you're not competing in a tested organization, I think it's completely fine. I don't think it's fine from a health standpoint, and there's a ton of evidence against using it for health reasons. But in terms of just morality, I think it's fine. But I do think that people who are going to stay natural do have to tread a fine line between who they're going to take advice from and who they are not. And I think that generally, if you are natural, you should be listening to natural lifters, because people who are enhanced, there is almost this PED amnesia that a lot of them have, that they almost forget how hard it was to even gain a pound of muscle after many years of being natural. This happens over and over and over again. And unfortunately, even if those people then back off on doses, they still have years and years and years of that advantage, especially if they maintain on TRT and whatnot. So everything kind of gets clouded, and you really do lose the ability to really decipher exactly what was working. So if you are a natural lifter, I do think that in general, you should listen and follow other natural lifters, with the caveat that you still have to understand that your genetics are going to be completely different, and you have to factor that in. So that's my recommendation in general. Find people who are kind of doing what you're doing, but a few levels higher, and do that. If you are going to be enhanced, then you may want to follow more enhanced lifters. And again, maybe not follow Mr. Olympia, but follow people who are in a similar situation, but a few levels above you. That gives you the motivation to climb a little bit higher without getting completely lost in people who are so far ahead or have such different genetics that it's not even relevant to you. So anyway, guys, that is the video I have for you today. Let me know if you want to hear more topics like this, discussing maybe current events or current posts and things related to the fitness industry. Comment down below, subscribe for more, and I will see you next time.